Hi. So this will be the first of our video lectures rather, through YouTube, just because I feel like that's a more, I don't know, accessible, easy to manage system, and I think I know how to work it a little better than Canvas, because Canvas doesn't let me do a lot of things where I have to I have to upload something less than 500 MBs, which honestly I don't even know what an MB is, so YouTube it is. Cool. I hope you enjoyed The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World. That's such a fun story. Fun in a very quirky kind of way, right? It's a weird story in that there's a lot happening, but not a lot on the page itself. It's a short story. Short as in it's not very long, and it's jam-packed with a lot of details that seem frivolous and not necessary, but we do need to unpack that a little bit and see how those details are being used to create this character, the drowned man. So I'll start off with a brief explanation of Garcia Marquez. Gabriel Garcia Marquez is one of the major writers of the 20th century. He's possibly the most famous Latin American writer of all time. I know one of you guys likes Isabel Allende, who is also, she's from Chile. She's also pretty famous. But Gabriel Garcia Marquez is really famous for his magical realism. And magical realism is exactly what it sounds like. It's realism, so reality, regular, kind of, you could believe it, with a twist of magic in it. So magical realism is going to be different than fantasy because magical realism, the characters within a magically realist world are just going to go with it. They're not going to question the weirdness. They're not going to question anything like that. They're just going to go with it, accept it as it is. So magical realism in that sense is way different than fantasy. So something like Harry Potter is not going to be magically realist because people don't know about the magic, right? Like there's that scene where Dudley finds out that Harry's a wizard, or when the Dudleys find out that Harry's a wizard, they freak out because they're like, this is an anomaly. Yes, we know Lily is a witch, but we're still not okay with that. Here's our nephew who we're an asshole to, but he's also very strange. So that is fantasy because it is a world that is separate from the reality, right? So there's a lot happening. As I'm talking to you, my brother just texted me, I'm downloading the new Harry Potter game. Coincidence. Okay, so magical realism. I'm trying to think of an example of magical realism. So it is rather of a spectrum. So I think of it in terms of TV a lot of the time. So you have something that is purely realist, like Breaking Bad. That's something that could happen. I don't suggest you do it, but and then you have on the other side something that's purely fantasy, like Game of Thrones. In between would be magical realism, and their critical part of it is the people in the world go along with the magic. They don't question it. They accept it for what it is. Okay. So magical realism is a Latin American invention. It's a literary form that came directly out of Latin America. If you watch Narcos on Netflix, they have a little explanation in it, I think season 1. But Latin American, Gabriel Garcia Marquez was a major Latin American writer, possibly the most famous. He's a huge deal. He won the Nobel Prize. When I first studied Garcia Marquez when I was in college, I took a Spanish lit class. He died the same day that we were talking about one of his books. So he is very important to me in that sense that there seems to be a lot of connections of weirdness with him that I appreciate and I think add to his kind of dominating presence in literature. Okay, so this story, we know what it's about. This guy drowns, and he's stunningly beautiful, and no one really knows what to do about it. So when you read the story, I want you to think, or when you write your discussion post, rather, I want you to think about how this main character is described. So when we describe a character, it's called characterization, right? Like that is something we understand. We see the trajectory of the character throughout the story. His character doesn't change physically, but his reception changes, right? So how he is received in the city is changing, how people respond to him, all these things. So going back to Breaking Bad right quick, we start off in season 1 with Walter White's character as being this pathetic character. We feel bad for him because he's got cancer, he's a teacher, he has this shitty life, and he, throughout the course of the show, that characterization changes as we go along. From season to season, Walter White becomes less Walter White and more Heisenberg. And that's an example of characterization. How we go from one, at the very beginning of the story, how one character is from here all the way here. Okay? So it is an arc. So, in this story, how is the handsomest drowned man in the world received as a character when he first shows up? He's a plaything, and then at the end, something happens to him. What is that change? What induces that change? And there's a lot of things that kind of come into question here, right? Like, a lot of things are a factor in this characterization. One of them is his physical being. So how he is as a person in a physical sense. So he's enormous, and it seems like this out-of-world kind of style, or out-of-world kind of being, and he seems really alien. But they go along with it, and the people in the village really do start to change too. So they're characters as well, and so we see how the drowned man, Esteban, comes to change the people too. So how is that characterization working? What about the story is political? Villagers become a family towards the end of this. Garcia Marquez uses the specific word kinsman, which is, deliberate. He deliberately uses it. So this villagers are very kind of disparate people. Yes, they work together, but they live in individual houses. It's a very specific number. There's 20 houses, all these things. But at the end, these villagers all come together and create a kind of kinship. And so when we have kinship, it's another word for family. So Garcia Marquez uses particular words that describe family. So it's mother, father, cousins, aunts, uncles. He uses these words to create the village, or to characterize the village. One of the last things I want to talk about, these videos won't be too terribly long, just because I want you guys to do a lot of the analytical work. So 2 more things. His name, Esteban, which is the Spanish translation of the name Sebastian. So when we have, in literature, you always want to think about how names are working. This is the only named character, but he's voiceless. We don't get any characterization or any voice from him. But Sebastian is a particularly important name when you consider the religious implications of it. So when we're reading something and we have somebody's character named, have a character named Mary or Joseph, or Jesus, right? These are things that we pick up on because they're in our cultural memory. Sebastian, while he's not the most popular saint, he is a pretty important saint, especially during the bubonic plague. So medieval era, people prayed to Saint Sebastian because they were like, we're all dying, we need somebody to help us. So they prayed to Saint Sebastian, who was a martyr and did sacrifice him, which means he sacrificed himself. So people flock to Sebastian in times of dire need. And there's a part in the story where all the characters realize that their farms are slowly dying, their courtyards are parched, all these things are happening in their village that really make them struggle. And the drowned man really does become this kind of symbol of change for this entire community and the global world. And that brings me to the last bit of this story that I want to talk about, is the captain at the end of the story. So we know about colonialism. That is something that is pretty well known. Western countries, predominantly white countries, invaded others and colonized them, and those people who were already living in the colony become the colonized. So colonialism is going to be something that is fundamental to 20th century, or to 20th century literature, really, because colonialism ends in the middle of 1953, I guess, would be the end of colonialism. No, I don't know. I would say 1947, but it does end a little bit. And now we have neocolonialism, so I don't want to stick to one particular date. But Queen Elizabeth II is a major figure because her father saw the end of colonialism for the British Empire. So the British Empire collapses under him, and Queen Elizabeth becomes this new monarch who doesn't deal with it. So she doesn't have to, she does not specifically go to India and say, we're going to colonize you. She doesn't do that. So she becomes queen in the early 1950s, so I kind of attributed that to date. But in this, so colonialism is a product of capitalism. So country goes into another country and they want to grow crops and shit, and they send them back to the original country so that they can sell them, right? So it's all for profit. Capitalism is about buying and selling for profit. Another way to think about this is slavery as a product of capitalism. That's something I don't know if we'll talk about in this class particularly, but in my other classes I really really harp on that, because I think it is such a fundamental thing to understand in America, is that how bad slavery really was. Like that, especially particularly because we're in the South, is slavery was so fucked up that that fucked upness, so to speak, has been almost erased from the cultural memory in the South because of, I don't know, what we're taught in school. All these things are happening, right? So slavery is another product of capitalism, and we see that working in colonialism too. We won't get into all that. But the captain at the end of the story is somebody who's really important, because though he is not very prominent, he is important because he is this figure of colonialism and potentially slave trading. So this captain looks at the end of the what's it called? He looks at the shore where Esteban's village is, and he says a particular thing, and I'll try to read it. Hopefully my thing doesn't cut off. No, it should be going. Okay, so I'll read this last bit. So the captain's looking at the guy, or at the village, and he says, or the narrator says, that in future years at dawn, the passengers on great liners would awaken, suffocated by the smell of gardens on the high seas, and the captain would have to come down from the bridge in his dress uniform with his astrolabe, his pole star, and his row of war medals, and pointing to the promontory roses on the horizon, he would say in 14 languages, "Look there, where the wind is so peaceful now that it's gone to sleep beneath the beds. Over there, where the sun's so bright that the sunflowers don't know which way to turn. Yes, over there. That's Esteban's village." So Esteban's power is so particularly profound that colonialism doesn't even reach this island, this village. So we have this colonial figure who's like, no, I can't even fuck with these people. They have Esteban's protection. I'm not even gonna go there. So that's one way that that's one of the ways that we're seeing politics working here, is Garcia Marquez, who comes from a colonized space, virtually all of South America was colonized, comes from this place where it is, and Central America, where colonialism is particularly rampant, right? So Garcia Marquez creates this world with this out of this world being, this alien-like figure who is so powerful that colonialism doesn't touch them. And in that sense, this story becomes something very hopeful and very particularly, kind. Garcia Marquez is known for that, where he creates these stories that are particularly hopeful and good. Good not in the sense that, oh, that's a good short story. Yes, that's true. But good in the noun sense, like Superman does good, right? He does good for the world. Garcia Marquez creates these worlds that are inherently good. So I hope that's a good kind of intro into the Garcia Marquez story. I really enjoyed it. It's not very long. If you haven't read it yet, please do. It's only like 4 pages or whatever, and the font is big. You'll enjoy it. It's weird. Pay attention to how the characters are changing, and use lenses to read this story. You're going to reap a lot out of lenses if you use it properly and read the stories. Have a great day. Hope you're enjoying the reading. Bye.